Thanks again for coming. I believe most of you here are very familiar with Altair because this is primarily an audience of clients and some friends of the firm. But for those of you who brought a guest, and for those who would just like a refresher, Altair is a private independent wealth advisory firm providing investment management, financial planning, and client education services to about 270 client families. And one of the things we take a lot of pride in is putting together events like these that may be a bit out of the financial and investment realm, but are really pertinent issues in our client's life. So over the past 3 years, we've done some like raising kids in a family with wealth, selecting a trustee and creating trusts that reflect your family values, and managing the care of elderly parents. And every year we ask clients, what is it that you would like us to look into? What are areas where we can be helpful in your family life? And in talking to clients in discussions this year and getting evaluations from programs like this, a lot of people told us they'd like a program on retirement. Now, when I looked around at programs on retirement, there's a lot of them. Banks do these, educational institutions do them, and guess what they all tend to have in common as a theme? Saving for retirement. In fact, there's almost no other programs that I could find that touched a lot of other aspects of retirement. And when I think about our client base and the families that we work with, I think there's a little bit less of a concern of, can I afford to retire? And there's more of a need of, how can I retire? Or what do I want to do? What will I do then? And this is due in part, I think, to the demographics that we serve, because a lot of our clients are entrepreneurs, and they're at the helm of their own company. And a lot of them are also executives leading significant companies. So these are big jobs, and they're done by people who are generally really excited about what they get up in the morning to go and do. So to step away from this kind of professional life is hard. And no matter what your financial resources, replacing the satisfaction of those types of careers is also hard. What are the practice and things we can do to make a plan so that we have the same amount of planning and are ready for retirement in the same ways just as we are for the financial aspects? So it's a little bit different of a spin on this topic, and when we set out to look for experts in this area, there was a lot of people I found who speak on happiness and sort of the different components of happiness and what makes that up. And that was interesting and kind of a part of it, but we really felt like we had more of a niche or subset component of the overall happiness topic, so we dug a little deeper. And luckily, my colleague, Dave Carpenter, remembered an interview from his days as a reporter with the Associated Press with a guy named John Nelson about this specific topic, which is happiness and fulfillment in retirement. And so I started Googling John and looking up his work and watching little YouTube clips, and I realized how perfect of a fit it was with what we wanted to do. And when I called John and we started talking about it, we ended up talking for a long time and realizing that this was really good. His work aligned with a lot of the goals of our programs. So he's going to be really bookending our program today. He's going to start off by helping us get grounded this morning in the concepts and elements of a successful retirement, and then helping to put each of us put pen to paper towards the end of the day and really write out what are our goals and what are some action steps that we're going to take to get there. So as an introduction, John is a retirement coach, and he's co-author of the award-winning book, What Color is Your Parachute for Retirement? I know a lot of us are familiar with What Color is Your Parachute. I got it in college, so to start off your career. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he leads workshops all across the country on retirement fulfillment. So it's my pleasure this morning to welcome John to the podium. Thank you. I'll let you take yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for coming today. It's a really exciting topic, and it's wonderful to work with a firm like Altair, who represents really the epitome of the white hat folks in the financial area. So I'm pleased to be here and to be able to share this with you today. So as Laura said, today is organized in a certain way, so we'll go over some structural things this morning about what retirement is now, what a successful retirement is, what life stages are turning out to be as society is changing now. Then we'll move into one of those components and talk about health and wellness for people approaching or thinking about or in retirement. We'll talk about financial aspects in particular that Altair is uniquely qualified to address. Then we'll have lunch, and then we come back, and we'll roll up our sleeves because I'll return after lunch, and as Laura said, we'll actually take out pen and paper and do a few exercises that I think will get our brains thinking about what we want to do around some of these subjects. Fair enough? Okay, good. So, foundational elements. This morning we want to answer 3 questions. The first is, what is retirement now? So we throw that term around, but we all have different ideas floating around in our head about what retirement is. We know it's not the same as our grandparents or our parents probably thought of it. Another question we need to answer is, how does this new idea of retirement fit into life in general, the human lifespan and life stages, because that's changing. And then third, we also talk about a successful retirement, and we'll look specifically at what that would really mean. Again, what is the definition of success? So who's heard of the original What Color Is Your Parachute, the job hunting book? Okay. The way that I got involved in doing this one is that I started out as a pension consultant, setting up and administering pension plans, mostly for small and medium-sized businesses and family firms. So I worked purely on the financial side of retirement for over 20 years. And the assumption, of course, that we had was that if we set up a pension plan and the company employees and owners have sufficient financial assets for retirement, everything will be great, right? They have enough money. What else is there? But I was in that field long enough to actually see people retire, and they had plenty of money, but then they'd retire, and then I'd see them a year or 2 later, and some of them were like a little lost. You know, they hadn't really figured out what was next for them. They weren't necessarily automatically happy just because they had sufficient financial resources. And then some of them, actually, after retirement, they didn't stay healthy that long. You know, that they had been kind of on the cusp maybe of some health problems. And so some of the things they'd wanted to do in retirement, they actually didn't have enough health or vitality to do that. And so as I noticed this pattern, I said, well, helping people plan their retirement is really life planning. It's not just financial planning. So after doing that for a while, I said, I need to figure out what planning really would be. We talk about life planning, but what are the elements? What is it that we'd want to look at in the same way we plan our finances? And so I'd been with a consulting firm for years, and I decided to work on a PhD to try to research this. And I realized that it would take me a year or a couple of years to get the coursework done and then go do some research. So I took a leave of my senses, basically. And I quit my job. I enrolled at the University of Wisconsin. And I traveled, and one of the things that I did was I traveled around the country, and I went to 16 states and interviewed who I thought were people doing this kind of comprehensive life stage planning. And it was financial planners, it was academics. I went to conferences. There were some employers that were particularly good at doing this kind of thing, helping people kind of step up and think about planning their life in a more comprehensive way. But I think what kind of sums up some of that research that I did was an interview that I conducted with a fellow who had been a university professor, and he was now about 80, and he lived in a beautiful retirement community that had a continuum of care, right? So he was in a beautiful condominium with big windows looking out at a beautiful oak forest, and it was wonderful. I mean, anyone would want to live there, but he lived there because this facility then had assisted living and full nursing home capabilities and all those kinds of things. So he was thinking ahead. And so as I went into this condominium, essentially, to interview him, in this building, in the hallway, as you walk down, that what they actually had was all of the people who lived there created their own nameplates for the door to their condo. And some people, you know, used watercolors and literally made like a little painting. And one was even made out of ceramics. And so these people had really put a lot of thought into personalizing that. And when I got to this gentleman's door to conduct the interview, the nameplate on the door of his condo was from his university office where he had retired 20 years before. And I thought that was really interesting. And you're probably maybe guessing what this interview was like. And the truth is, he had never really done anything after that, after he retired from the university, that really engaged him, or that he found that meaningful. And so here was a fellow who had plenty of money, his health was good, his wife, however, had passed away. And he was not socially engaged, he was not psychologically engaged, and really, after he retired, he just never really grabbed onto anything. And so that story came to symbolize, to greater or lesser degrees, what can happen to people, even successful, smart people. And so, as I traveled around, I realized that there were some elements that we can look at, and that's what we'll look at today. So the first question, not to be obvious, but what is retirement? There's a really old idea of retirement, right? Which is the fact that you don't have to do anything. And that seems attractive. But there's this new idea, people talk about being retired, and they're almost doing the exact same thing as when they weren't retired. So what's the truth of this? What does this have to do with what's changing? So to get beyond this kind of dichotomy we have now, I said, what we really want to do is understand the human life course. What we want to do is we want to understand what happens to people across the life course and where are we individually on that path. And so I found the oldest story that I could to answer that question. So to understand what retirement, or to start to understand retirement, I went back to ancient Greece and I found a 2,000-year-old story. And when I explain this, you will start to remember this story. So this is, anybody know who this is by chance? Okay. So this is a young man. His name is Oedipus. Now Oedipus will go on to become famous or infamous for some unusual family arrangements later in his life. And Freud thought it was really interesting in the Oedipal complex, but this is before that. Oedipus is a young man, he's a traveler, he's on the road to Thebes, and he encounters the Sphinx. Body of a lion, wings of an eagle, head of a woman. This is not Hillary Clinton. So he encounters the Sphinx, and she challenges him. And she says, I'm going to tell you a riddle. If you can solve the riddle, you may pass. And if you cannot, I'll kill you. So it's like Jeopardy, but with higher stakes, right? Now, don't tell me the answer, but tell me, do you remember the riddle of the Sphinx? Anyone? Okay. So you remember. So what creature, she says, in the morning walks on 4 legs, at midday walks on 2, and in the evening walks on 3 legs? Does it sound a little familiar? Okay. And the answer, of course, is man, or mankind. Walking or crawling on all 4s as a baby, on 2 legs as an adult, and walking with the help of a cane in old age. Now, why does this story stick around for a few thousand years? I think partly because we all have this innate desire to have a sense of where we've been and where we're going in life. And the other thing that's powerful about it is it connects our human life journey essentially to the passing of a day, right? Morning, midday, evening. And what it tells us at a deep level is that this process that we all go through is an inherently natural one, that we, aligned with and connected with nature, that is the natural order of things. Youth, adulthood, old age. And so it's okay. That's the way things are. Does that make sense? An ancient story. So we'll fast forward to about the 1840s. So there are many such illustrations from this period. I like this one because it was preserved pretty well, but it's the life and ages life stages, essentially, of a man. And this is in 10-year increments for the most part. Life and ages of a woman. So we've had this kind of yearning to understand where we go in life. So I have a couple questions for you. There are some unconscious beliefs packed into this. The first is that there is some kind of an arc, right? There's an ascendance and a descent. So what is it that's ascending and what is it that's descending? So when we talk about this, often people will say, well, if we think financially or economically, because of course a lot of this happened when wealth was measured in cows or acres or livestock, right? Not necessarily even in dollars. But it maybe has to do with accumulating economic assets and using them. Maybe it has to do with earning power. Maybe it has to do with economic power in society. Or maybe it has to do with social prominence, that we all, in fact, ascend in our social engagement, in our wisdom, how we're valued in society, maybe the contribution we can make to society. All those things rise to a certain point, and then it's perceived, of course, that it starts diminishing. Maybe it's that this ascent and descent, maybe it's physical. You know, the peak of health is probably in your 20s or 30s, but in terms of your ability to be vital and use your body to be active in the world, maybe that does peak at 50, and after that, a lower level of vitality and energy and health is what's descending here. What I have found, though, in interviewing people, is that, or my observation, is the artist who created this was not 80 years old. They were probably much younger. Because I think what this is a depiction of is the external view of what is happening in the human lifespan. And it's really a picture from the outside. Because when you talk with people who are out at the farther end, their subjective experience of aging may be like this, or it may be the opposite of this. Because when we ask people about life satisfaction, that may in fact continue to grow all the way across the lifespan. When we ask people about a sense of meaning and purpose, for some people, that continues to grow completely across the lifespan. When we ask people about their love and connection in their family or among friends, that may increase all the way across the lifespan. Does this make sense? And so what we all have to remember is that there is a societal view of what our life course is about, that society out there sees an ascent and a descent, but that doesn't have to be what we experience. So part of today is about letting loose of some of these maybe automatic, unconscious societal perceptions about aging, retirement, and the life course, and instead to start thinking about, from a subjective perspective, what it is that each of us are going to build and what it is that we want to experience in life. Does that make sense? So we need to maybe buck the system a little bit. So, who's this guy? Any guesses? Henry Ford, yeah. So, what happened was that oh wait, let me tell you one other thing. That this particular one doesn't do it, but there were many such illustrations, and what some of these did is actually, instead of liken the human life course to the passing of a day, it would use the seasons. So at the first part in youth, you'd see spring, and maybe there would be foliage and the things from the natural environment suggesting spring, and then summer, and then autumn, and then lastly winter. So again, 1840s, agricultural society, and the idea was connecting the human lifespan and human aging to another natural event, which is the passing of the seasons. And the message, of course, is that's natural, that's the way it works, it's okay. This particular one, the quality is much better, so I use this one. But this passing of the seasons is an important idea. So Henry Ford. So this gradualness of the passing of a day, this gradualness of the passing of seasons, that's not very an efficient way to look at life. And while Henry did not invent the modern idea of retirement, he did contribute to the environment that created it. So Henry's famous for inventing the assembly line, right? So before Henry Ford, cars were made one at a time like craftsmen do. And the way that he created the assembly line was through standardization, right? He standardized the parts, the manufacturing process. He standardized what workers do individually. And this standardization yielded efficiency. It was so effective, it was so powerful in the Industrial Revolution that this idea of standardization expanded far beyond the factory floor. And these same ideas leaked out into offices and professional practices, and the power of standardization is something that moved the economy forward. And in general, of course, it was a good thing economically. But one of the things that happened through standardization was we standardized people's behavior too. So for example, in an agrarian society, you don't punch into work at 7 a.m. and have a coffee break at 10 and punch out for lunch at noon and have a coffee break at 3 and punch out at 4. But once we were in factories, we started to do that. We standardized this human behavior, right? And we started to do the same thing with the human life course. That is when we invented retirement. So my co-author of the original What Color is Your Parachute, Dick Bowles, coined this term many years ago, but he called it the 3 boxes of life. And we standardized life. We said, well, what we're really going to do is have 3 stages. The first stage is education, second stage work, third stage is retirement. And the reason Dick Bowles called these boxes is because they're so different from each other that when we're in one, it's hard to really understand even what's going to happen in the next one. That we're cut off from that in a way. So that gradualness of the day or the seasons in the way we used to live, the way we lived for thousands of years, well, less than 100 years ago, we standardized the breaking up of that into these sharp divisions. By the way, how old is retirement? Well, when was the Social Security Act put into place? 1936. Before that, retirement was a rare thing. So as a society, we created a system whereby people could begin to stop working at a certain age and be supported financially. At the same time, we created the public school system. In fact, John Dewey here in Chicago was one of the masterminds of what that system would look like, public education for an entire country. Before that, there were country schools and some city schools, but in terms of actually creating a comprehensive public education system, we invented that just about 100 years ago. So it was when we created something for people to do early in life, people late in life, and we standardized this and we broke life into these parts. We'd never had those sharp divisions before. Children worked as apprentices, worked in family businesses, tradespeople, farms, and older people, of course, they continued to contribute, probably less physically, but maybe more with wisdom and insight as they aged. And all that went out the window, really, about 100 years ago. So as a society, this actually wasn't too bad of an idea because people like getting out of factories, right, and having a retirement. So there's a key activity for each of these boxes. The first activity, of course, for education is development. When we're young, we're investing in developing ourselves. And then it's about productivity. We turn into productivity machines, right? We're taking on responsibilities. We get married, take on a mortgage, have kids, we coach soccer, we go to PTA, we might be active at church. We do 101 things. We're productivity machines, right, for decades. And then, all of a sudden, we switch over. And the original idea of retirement was for worn-out workers, right? Worn-out cogs of the Industrial Revolution. And what would worn out people who were only going to live a few years, what could they do? Well, we're putting them out to pasture, essentially. So the original idea of retirement was based on leisure. So a shift from work to leisure, from productivity to leisure. So as a society and individually, this was actually a good system. People weren't going to live that long and were worn out when they got there. One problem as a society, though. People didn't die on schedule. Retirees weren't supposed to live that long. And so the actuaries that designed Social Security, they got a surprise because medical care improved and public health improved, and all these people lived longer than they were supposed to. So what happened to the funding mechanism for Social Security? The numbers didn't work out. Now, as a society, we have to figure out what to do about this. But in general, of course, it's probably a good thing. People like living longer, so that's okay. But on a personal level, what does it mean? It means that pure leisure for 5 or 10 years, that's a good idea. But what if people live 20 years or longer in retirement? Leisure's not enough. So people who've been doing that are mixing up the boxes. They're saying, well, if I were only going to be around for 5 or 10 years, then developing myself wouldn't have any point. But if I'm going to be around for 20, I'd like to learn some new things and invest in personal development if I'm not working anymore. Or maybe I'd like to continue working. Just 10 years ago, when I was conducting this research, the word retirement career was not a common one. It's like jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron, right? And now people talk about a retirement career all the time. So the idea is that if we're going to be around longer, we can do all these things, that these old rules that we invented 100 years ago, they don't apply. So a better way, in fact, rather than the 3 boxes, these industrialized 3 boxes, which ended up not applying just to people working in industry, but really across all of society, there's a better way to think about the modern life course. And this was actually an idea from a professor at Cambridge, Peter Laslett. And the funny thing was, he wasn't an economist or a psychologist or a sociologist, he was a historian. And he looked at history, and he looked at all of history, and he said, for millennia, people have had these gradual life changes, this arc of life. And we standardized it into these boxes. That's not going to last. That system is not going to work as a society. And so he came up with what he thought was a new version of where we'll be, what's happening now. And I think when you think about your friends and family members and you look at people in the world, this may resonate a little bit. What he suggested was that we're moving into a system for most people of 4 ages of life. And they overlap with the 3 boxes, but the big thing, first of all, is that the transitions between these are much more fluid. And the first is focused on the first age is about development. The second age, as you imagine, is about taking on responsibility and being productive. The third age is for freedom, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And the fourth age is really about reflection. So if we talk about development for a moment, does anyone, maybe in your own family or you have friends, a generation ago people went to high school, they went to college, they graduated at 21, they started their first job, they got their own apartment, and they were gone, right? Now, do you have friends with kids who have maybe been in and out of college or graduate school and living back at home and through their 20s? Raise your hand if you've seen that. Okay. Now, there are some people who think that's dysfunctional or this generation, right, isn't as responsible. No, Peter Laslett said that these transitions now are becoming much more fluid. Life is more complex. Life is longer. And to make that transition, it's not like graduating from high school at 18 and going to work in the foundry like everyone else. No, it's about figuring out a complex life path in this more permeable, fluid boundary between development and responsibility. It's a societal phenomenon. So what about responsibility? Well, we know we take that on, right? We do that on purpose. We seek out responsibilities. Let's jump to the fourth age. Let's come back to the third. So the fourth age is infirmity. That really is this, even if it's not sickness, it's the part of life where our energy is low, maybe not a lot of mobility, activity, we may be sick. And is that just a bad thing, or like the passing of the day, like the passing of the seasons, is there in fact a purpose for that? Is there a function of that? And when you spend time around aged people, around the elderly, probably one of the first things you notice is that invariably they tell stories, right? Often the same stories over and over. And part of that is nostalgia, like you'd imagine. But a deeper part of that is that telling stories to ourselves and to others is how we make sense of our lives. It's how we make sense of the life we have lived. So this long, wild ride that I've been on, what was that really about anyway? Why was I here? What was this thing about my life? And revisiting those stories is how we make meaning, how we make sense of that. So that fourth age that's out there, it has a function, it has a purpose, and it's part of the natural order of things. So, what about the third age? This is Peter Laszlo's contribution. That as a society, for the first time ever in history, we're going to have people who move beyond responsibility. That is, they've got enough money or economic security, their kids are grown, their responsibilities have diminished or been taken care of, but yet they're not old or sick yet. They're pretty healthy. What do they do? What do they do with that? And that was his contribution, is to say this is a time of unparalleled freedom for you personally, probably, but for others in society to have this freedom. And of course, my question is, freedom for what? Freedom to what end? And that's a really individual decision. Does this make sense? Have you been seeing this in people you know, where now they're freed of these responsibilities, but they're not really old yet, or if they're old, they're pretty healthy. They're definitely not in the fourth age, right? Not everyone transitions well to the third age. Some of us cling on to the responsibility and the productivity of the second age. And in fact, I suggest that that transition be a gradual one, like the changing of the seasons. And so having a picture of what's next helps us make those transitions gracefully and mindfully and consciously, rather than maybe unconsciously staying attached to something. You know, especially if you've founded a company or you're running a family business, we become really attached to that role and that responsibility, that status, that ability to use our skills, all those things happen. And so being mindful about how we make the transition, rather than maybe mindlessly holding on because we haven't thought it through, it's a good thing to be aware. And if we work for someone else, and that makes that transition more abrupt, just remember that being a vice president of ABC company on Friday and being a retiree on Monday, that's a really abrupt transition, and not an easy one. And in most of human history, we didn't set out to do it that way. So making this more gentle transition is a good idea, if possible. So if that's where we are, if that's what's going on in life, then what's a successful retirement? According to the experts, that is. We get to decide for ourselves. Well, in looking at this and looking at what the experts had to say was a successful or a good retirement, the first thing we ran into, of course, is financial or economic success. And financial planners don't use this term, but economists, when they look at data sets and statistics about what's going on in society, they actually use a term sometimes, and it's called economic well-being. And for them, economic well-being means essentially people retaining their income or retaining their purchasing power in retirement, right? So that their standard of living doesn't diminish when they retire. That's economic well-being. And so that certainly is the foundation of retirement. But a funny thing happened, which is that economists weren't the only ones using the term well-being, is that there's this idea of health and well-being. And the medical world and others use that term, and I thought, well, geez, they're not talking about income level at all. They're talking about health and your physical body, but they're also using the term well-being. Not a common term, but one we all know. And then, of course, if you look a little bit farther, you discover that even the psychologists use the term well-being, psychological well-being, when they mean happiness, right? And I said, well, they're all using this, but they're not talking to each other. They're in silos. They're looking at different parts of life. And as individuals, of course, we don't live in silos. Our life is one holistic, comprehensive thing. And so there's some wisdom in language. And when you simply look in the dictionary for well-being, you usually see this. A state of prosperity, health, and happiness. And so no word means any one thing. If you look in a dictionary from 50 years ago and look up net, it only has to do with fish and fishermen, right? And now it has to do with the global communication network. And so in the same way, a few hundred years ago, speakers of the English language, in their wisdom, they crowdsourced the meaning of well-being. And they came up with this. Now, why would this be the case, you might wonder? Well, as it turns out, prosperity is well-being in the physical world. So whether that's goats and sheep and cows or dollars, prosperity is how we manage and control the physical world with money or directly. If we're prosperous, it's the physical world around us. What about health? It's our physical body. Happiness? Well, that's non-physical. It's our experience. And so it really covers the whole range, and speakers of the English language figured this out. I was really impressed. As it turns out, there's actually a relationship between these. When we look at the research of people in the world, we discover that prosperity and health are the foundation for happiness. They create the foundation that allows happiness to happen, but they can't make it happen. There's no amount of prosperity or health which by themselves will create happiness. It's possible to be prosperous and healthy and also unhappy. So as it turns out, we can actually start making plans, specific plans, for each of these areas. You know, it's hard to be happy if you're poor or sick. What's interesting about this, however, especially for the people in this room, is that there is an objective prosperity, right? How many dollars are in your portfolio? What's your standard of living? Are those out of whack or are they coherent? But there's also a subjective prosperity. And that I've worked with many people who, in fact, they had plenty of money, but they were never quite comfortable. That is, they were always a little anxious or uncertain. And that while they might have been prosperous, they didn't feel fully prosperous. And that, in fact, quickly can get in the way of happiness. And in terms of physical health, it can almost be kind of the other way around, is that what you've probably seen among people as well, is you can feel healthy, but if you haven't actually participated in the kind of wellness and lifestyle changes that support ongoing health, you can feel fine right up until that heart attack. You can feel fine right up until you're diagnosed with diabetes or high cholesterol or something. So the subjective aspect of health, in fact, can be misleading, and that's why we take health risk assessments and get in the kind of in-depth early checkups that we need to make sure that we're on the right path. So as it turns out, each of these areas has a body of research that gives us clues. So obviously happiness is psychosocial, it's psychological and it's social. One of the reasons, and in fact this afternoon we'll talk specifically just about happiness, is psychosocial. Health is biomedical, meaning medical access to a medical system, but in terms of managing our own biology, wellness, lifestyle factors, medicine really can't do that for us. We have to be in charge of our own biology, and that's what the panel following this will talk about. So why is prosperity geo-financial? What does geography have to do with finance? So is $1 million for retirement, is that a lot of money in Manhattan? No. Manhattan, Kansas? Yeah. $1 million means different things depending on where you are in the face of the earth. And so no amount of money means anything unless it's connected to geography. And especially as people are approaching retirement, sometimes we think about changes in geography, right? We might be attached to some activities in a certain place, or we raised our kids in a certain area and they don't live there. And so the third presentation today will really be somewhat about that, but really recognizing not just the financial side of prosperity, but connecting that with how and where we use that money in the world to make sure that we're objectively prosperous, but also that we do have a sense of our subjective prosperity, that we feel prosperous enough to be happy. But it's simple enough to think about it this way. So so it's actually what I ended up doing was creating an educational curriculum, which is around this. And about 10 years ago, there was a program put together by a nonprofit entity that was brought in to work with the federal government for federal employees, because the federal government is the largest single employer. And while the federal government has always been a good provider of retirement benefits, they'd never done retirement education. And so they were going to create the first retirement education program for federal employees. And it was from the HR department, essentially for all federal agencies. It's called the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. So let me make a statement. If I offend anybody, I apologize. Not everything that Congress does is genius. Is that okay? All right. But they have their moments, because Congress actually created a bill, passed a bill, ordering the Office of Personnel Management to create a retirement education program. And in Congress's shining moment, they said that the program should cover financial and non-financial aspects of a successful retirement. Pretty good idea. So OPM looked around, though, and said, well, what would the non-financial aspects be? Nobody really has looked at that. And they looked around, but, well, they said, there's this goofball in Wisconsin, John Nelson, and he's actually looking at that. So they adopted my curriculum, and I worked on that program for about a year to create this retirement education program, to make it available to federal employees. Now, I have no idea how many they actually went through the program or anything. I wasn't involved in that, but I helped create it. So the first thing that's really interesting, though, that I discovered is that there is no happiness in the federal government. So the model had to change a little bit, and retirement readiness was about networking. So it was about social engagement, getting information, getting support, making a social transition, networking, overall health, and then wealth planning. And because the federal government, they love acronyms, this is about retirement readiness. What do we want? Retirement readiness. When do we want it? Now. See that? So, in fact, I even designed a beautiful interactive online component where people could answer a bunch of questions about their networking and psychosocial readiness, about their overall health assessment, as well as financial. Here we are driving the OPM car down the road to retirement. But as you can guess, it was never built, or it didn't work if it did, so I don't know. It was a nice idea. So we're in our infancy here of putting these elements together. This is a new thing. We're thinking about this in new ways. So let me tell you another story. Actually, this is really interesting, and then I'll tell you the other story. So when we talk about prosperity, we all have unconscious beliefs and mindsets around all these areas, mostly that we've inherited from our parents or grandparents or society at large, right? And we're not really conscious of these beliefs. We don't think about them. But here's a good one. When it comes to prosperity, who remembers what this is? Anybody? The game of life, Milton Bradley, right? So how do you win the game, or what happens when you win the game of life? Anybody remember? You end up in Millionaire Acres or the Poor Farm. And now, which is better, right? But that's it. It's a digital yes or no thing. And if you end up in Millionaire Acres, then everything's fine. You won, right? End of story. So that's that old thinking. And we literally were kids playing this game and just said, well, that's the end of the story, right? Millionaire Acres, I'm all set. What about health? Now, this is really interesting because there is objective and subjective health. Subjective health, I feel good. Objective health is what's going on in your biology. And let's check that. Let's test that. And I hate to put numbers on everything, but one way to do that is this. There are many studies like this. This is from a researcher at the University of Michigan, Eddington, who did a whole ream of studies about 15 years ago, where he looked at a couple of things. First of all, he quantified the costs for different groups of people. And the reason we're looking at this is not for cost, I'll explain in a minute, but just as a marker. But if we look at these age ranges of people, but then we look at low, medium, and high risk individuals, and then he figured out not what the out-of-pocket after insurance costs were, but the actual underlying medical costs on the average for these groups of people. And this is one particular study. The numbers now are irrelevant. The underlying concept is unequivocal, though. So what we see, as you'd expect, right, is that this medical cost goes up across age brackets, and it goes up as we go from people with low, medium, and high risk. Now, why is this really important? It's not the money. An out-of-pocket expense, it's more, but it's not like buying a more expensive car where you get something for it. What I view these numbers are basically what these people's involvement with the medical delivery system is. That is, how engaged are they in needing treatment? How big of a part of their life is it about getting medical treatment? Going to the doctor, going to the hospital, being at the clinic, taking medicines. And you can use that as a stand-in in many ways for health and vitality, right? The people who are spending more on medical care probably don't have the vitality, the energy to engage with life the way that they would want. So forget the dollars, it's what it symbolizes. Now, here's the most helpful part. Can we control this part? No, right? We all get older. What about this part? What is risk? Well, risk has, to oversimplify it, there are three factors. And the first one you can't really do much about, which is your family history or your genetic inheritance, right? So many diseases do have a significant genetic component. It's important to understand your family history so you can look for markers of those diseases early. So that's very much a watch kind of thing, but you can't choose your parents, at least not yet. But the second part has to do with your biomarkers, right? We all know there are early markers for diabetes and cholesterol, heart disease, and we change those through lifestyle factors. So we really and truly, and this is what the next panel discussion is about, is that we have the power, in some cases, to move to lower risk through lifestyle. That's the part we can control. And for my money is on being in as low risk a category as you can, because feeling good is not the best indicator of your true state of health. It's doing the health risk assessment, getting all the biological data. Does this make sense? Okay. And happiness is what we're actually going to talk about this afternoon. But I'd like to do two things around that. The first is tell you a story, and then a very short exercise where you're going to pair up with somebody at your table, and you're going to tell a story, literally about a 2 or 3 minute story. So it's a very short story. But remember when I talked about this university professor who had retired, and he had some of this retirement well-being stuff figured out, but not completely? There was another woman I worked with who was the director of a state agency, and she had a very successful career. And because she had been with the state for a long time, she was financially secure. But she had two challenges. One challenge was that she had not taken care of her body. She was just too hard of a worker, I think, too focused. And the second thing was that her entire social network pretty much revolved around this state department that she had been running. That was really her life. And she realized that when she left that role, that most of her social network would be left behind. So what she was able to do is she took an early retirement, and she started volunteering with the National Professional Association that she'd been connected to and had been a little connected with and active in. But she took her retirement from the state as an opportunity to start doing consulting for other states, but especially to serve on boards and committees of this national association. She ended up as the president a few years later. And so from a psychosocial, from a happiness perspective, she found something that was relevant, it was meaningful, she had special skills and knowledge, but she was able to bring that to the world in a way that was much more enjoyable and engaging for her. And she maintained and built her social network. The other thing that she did was that this new freedom from not working quite in the same way. She still worked hard, but it would be in particular time spans, is that she lost like 30 pounds, I think. And she transformed. She started exercising, she changed her diet, and I don't know what her biomarkers would say, but I have to imagine they greatly improved. And she really transitioned to a life stage that was the epitome of well-being. So you don't know this lady, but you know people who've done something like that, something similar. And these people can be your role models. So it's kind of funny because we walk through life and we all have role models. They're usually unconscious. But a role model is a figure, a real life person, or a historical figure, or even a fictional character that is a signal to us about how to act in a certain role. And often we're unconsciously adopting those behaviors once we have these role models. So tell me, for parenting, if you're a parent, who is your role model for parenting? Well, if you never thought about it, it's probably your own parents. Although sometimes it's a role model in terms of, yes, I'm going to do that, and sometimes I'm not going to do that at all, right? But nevertheless, or your first job, when you started in your career, there were people in that workplace that you consciously or unconsciously adopted as role models. It's kind of how you knew what to do in that workplace, right? And if you adopted really good role models, you had good habits, and you fared well in that situation. So we do that. As humans, we do it automatically. Well, I'm going to challenge you to start thinking about, for this next stage of life, whether you call it retirement or the third age, whatever it is, there are role models for you in that transition and for that stage of life. And the neat thing about a role model is once we kind of think of those people, there's a list of 10 things that we quickly can unpack and realize that are positive things that maybe they've done that can be insightful for us. And so it doesn't have to be the perfect role model, but right now, stop and think about somebody who you think is a role model or could be a role model for you about making this transition to retirement or the third age. And in a minute, I'm going to have you pair up with somebody next to you and literally in a 2-minute story, try to capture what it is you think some of the things that they have done or are doing that's made the difference. And if this is a living person, you might actually go meet with them and have a conversation and ask them. If they're not around anymore, just think about what they've done. So does everybody have at least somebody in mind? It doesn't have to be the perfect person, but think about somebody that you admire who's made that transition. And again, it's not that they have to be Mohandas Gandhi and perfect in every way, but somebody that has some qualities that you would like to emulate. And so choose your partner, and now I'm going to give you so get to the point, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're going to stop, we're going to pause, and then switch, and the second person can tell a story about someone that they would have as a role model, because I want to make sure that both of you get a chance to talk. Fair enough? You willing to do this? Okay. On your mark, get set, tell a story. Okay, come on back. Come on back. So, let me point out why doing this can be so powerful or so important, is that there's a part of our brain called the reticular activating system. And this is the part of our brain that when we teach it or show it that something is important, it automatically scans the environment for that thing without us having to pay attention or do it consciously. So a long time ago, people were walking through the forest, and there was a certain sound or something, and a bear appeared. And so part of your brain says, oh, if I hear that sound, there's a bear attached to it. And now, every time you're in the forest, you don't have to be listening for a bear. A part of your brain is in charge of listening for that, right? Or on the other hand, you're walking through the forest and you discover particular kinds of berries or something that you eat, and they're delicious and you don't die. And so part of your brain is in charge of keeping an eye out for those berries. And you don't have to watch for them. You walk down the path and your brain finds them automatically, unconsciously, right? We know this happens. And the key is you have to let your brain know that it's important. And then you can turn it over. And by starting to identify these successful role models, these people who are like you, but in the next stage of life, and starting to notice those people, you're putting a part of your brain in charge of seeing them, becoming aware of them. And that's what allows you to start kind of unpacking them and what they do and why that's been successful for them. And so what I hope is that this specific person that you told the story about today might be really useful. And it might also be that tomorrow or next week or the week after, you start to think of or notice other people that are like that you might emulate. And that one of the best ways for you to start to get ready for the life you want to live is to be aware of noticing these people and understanding what it is they do. Fair enough? Okay, so we will now spend some time talking about healthy as a successful retirement. We'll be talking about prosperity, and then I'll come back after lunch and we'll do a deep dive on planning for happiness. Okay? So, thank you very much, and now Laura will come back up.